Hi there, my name is Melissa and I am in my piano teaching studio where I've been a piano teacher for quite a few years. And this video is all about inversions for chords and seventh chords. If we have time, we'll also cover slash chords for lead sheet reading. I have a lot of students who learn pop music and who encounter seven chords right away. And I love to be able to teach how simple it is to find a seventh chord and play seventh chords. We also learn a lot of slash chords. So we're going to start fairly basic and talk today about how to invert chords first of all. Because learning chord inversions is very simple and very basic. And once you know how to do that, seventh chords and learning how to deal with those becomes quite easy and quite fast. So this is for students that I currently have or anyone else who's looking for some information about inverting chords and seventh chords and possibly slash chords. If you already have a teacher but you're just looking for more information and you have questions, definitely go to your teacher if you have questions. If you are a student of mine, you know where to find me if you have questions. I do encourage that if you have a theory workbook or if you have a theory program that you're working with, that you do practice some of these things in a theory workbook or even on some staff paper so that you get used to doing these inversions on your own. Writing them actually helps you recognize them in music. And I encourage you to take a piece of music after watching this video or as you're rewatching it and analyze it for the different chords and maybe write the chords the way I'm going to show you today. All right, so we're going to start very simple. And I'm just going to show you this on the whiteboard, and I will move this closer once I have a few things written. But for starters, we are going to start with a very basic chord in its triad form. This is a C major chord. We have the notes C, E, and G. And just to review, the reason that this is called a triad is a certain type of chord. And you have to know what a triad is. A triad, I wrote it on the top, is simply any chord that meets the following conditions. The distance in intervals between the bottom note of the chord, the C, and the middle note of the chord, in this case E, must be the interval of a third. It can be a major third, it can be a minor third. It does not matter the quality of the interval. What does matter is that it is the interval of a third between the bottom and the middle note. The interval between the bottom note and the top note must be a perfect fifth. So those are the two conditions that must be met in order to call it a triad. If you have a triad, the bottom note always names the chord. So in this case, I know for sure that I have a C chord. I don't necessarily know the quality yet, if it's major or minor. That will depend on the quality of the third. But I know that it is a triad definitely because I have those two conditions met. I have the interval of a third in the bottom two notes, the interval of a fifth in the top two notes. Now that's going to change because what we are going to do today is we are going to invert this chord. Chord inversions are really wonderful to have and to be able to see in music because it allows us as musicians to be more efficient and more effective in how we play music, but then it also gives a more musical setting to a lot of our chords. So for example, you would get bored of hearing a C chord playing like this all the time throughout the same song. It gets monotonous. So what we can do is we can revoice it. And we can change it within the course of a piece so that it's not so monotonous and not so boring. And that really changes kind of the texture of the chord. So that's what we're going to work on today is inversions, and then we'll add the sevenths and get really fun. So a chord inversion helps us by, I'm going to erase a couple things here, if I can find my eraser. Here it is. Okay, I'm going to erase this information about the triad because otherwise it gets too confusing here. And we know that that's a C chord. There we go. Okay. When we want to invert a chord, all we do is we take the bottom note and simply move it up one octave from its original position. So I'm going to draw an arrow here, and you can watch as I do this. I'm going to take the C, and in this case, in the treble clef, I'm going to move it up to where the next C on the staff lives. See that? Moving it up one octave. Then I'm simply going to move the other notes over. And now I have a first inversion, and it's still a C chord because I have the same three notes, they're just written in a different order. So now instead of C on the bottom, I have E on the bottom. A little bit different sound. I'll go back and redo a couple things here for you in a minute, but my second inversion, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the bottom note, which is now an E, and I'm moving it up an octave. So there's my E. I am going to keep the C, and I'm simply moving it over, straight over. Kept the C, and I'm keeping the G. This is now my second inversion, C chord. See that? So now I have a C chord in its root position where the C, the root of the chord, is on the bottom. I have it in first inversion where the C is on the top, and now I also have it in second inversion where the C is in the middle of the chord. I'm going to color these in so that you can see where the root note is on each chord. It's still a C chord. I've just changed the order of the notes, but it's always the same three notes. The trick that we use to identify very quickly on a staff if a chord is in first inversion or second inversion is, again, we look to the intervals. So for example, on a first inversion chord, I can always identify it very, very quickly because I know that the interval of a fourth is on the top of the chord. So the distance from the top note to the G is the interval of a fourth. That indicates always that it is a first inversion, or that the chord has gone to its first inversion. If we look at a second inversion chord, the interval of the fourth will always be on the bottom of the chord. The bottom two notes will form the interval of a fourth. So my first inversion, the C, the root of the chord, which names the chord, it's a C chord, is on the bottom. First inversion, the interval of a fourth is on the top, and the root note is now also on the top of the chord. In second inversion, the interval of the fourth is now on the bottom of the chord, and the root note is now in the middle of the chord. And we can do that with any chord that we want, and we can take and do inversions all day long. So I encourage you to do that. For example, with a G major chord, and invert a G chord in its first inversion and its second inversion. Okay, that's for you to practice. Now we're going to move on to seventh chords, and I'm going to do seventh chords before slash chords because then we'll do the slash notation all at once, which I think is easier for some people to understand once we have all the notes in there. So just redoing a couple things here on my whiteboard. If you saw the video, or if you already know about scale degrees, that's what you need to know to build a seventh chord. So I'm going to build a 7th chord, starting with a C. So I'm going to do a C major chord, and I'm going to start with a triad. So there's my C major triad right there. I know it's a C chord. My bottom note is a C. It's in root position, so the bottom note names the chord. My interval between the bottom note and the middle note is a third. My interval between my bottom note and my top note is a perfect fifth, so I know that it is a triad. I could write it another way, but you'll see in a minute why I didn't. So to turn this into a C7 chord, which you'll see a lot, all I have to do is think about my C scale. What is the 7th tone in a C scale? And if you have to write it out, you can, or you can use the keyboard to figure it out. And you can say, okay, well, the first tone of the scale is C, the second is D, the third degree is E, the fourth degree is F, the fifth degree is G, the sixth degree is A, the seventh degree is B, and the 8 or the 1 is back to the C. So if I write it like this, I've got my scale degrees. The 7th degree of the C scale must be a B. That is a C7 chord. Simple as that. I take my basic chord, my triad, and I add the 7th tone of the scale. Listen, I'll play it. C chord, C, E, and G. Now I'm going to add the 7th tone of the scale. Now, a lot of people want to know a little bit more about 7 chords, and so we always talk about what's the difference between a C7 chord, which has regular B, and a C7 chord, which is going to have a B flat, because quite often in music you'll see a C7 chord, and then in the left hand, like if you have full notation, not just a lead sheet, you'll see a C and a B flat indicated for the 7 chord. And that sounds like this. Now, B natural, B flat. Both of them are 7 chords, or chords with a 7th added. The B natural and the B flat, the only difference is one is a major 7th and one is a minor 7th. If you want the major 7th, you stick with the B. If you want it to be the minor 7th, you stick with the B flat. But that doesn't mean that you notate it C small m, indicating C minor, and then a 7th. That's not correct. In order to have a C minor 7th chord, I would have to begin with a C minor chord, which would indicate E flat in the middle. So C minor 7 is not referring to the quality of the interval. The quality of the interval is really just determined by the notation of the note. If I want a C7 chord, and someone said to me the other day, well, how do I know when I'm playing a C7 chord, how do I know if I should play it with a regular B or a B flat? And my answer is always, use your ears. Your ears will tell you what fits best in the music. If you're playing from a lead sheet, or if you're playing from full notation, and there's the chord symbol at the top, but then there's also both treble and bass notated, you can look in the bass clef in the piano part and see what works best for the song. If there's a B flat, then you can use a B flat chord if you want to. Or I'm sorry, a B flat in the chord if you want to, instead of B natural. All right, so how does this work with chord inversions? Because now we have 4 notes instead of 3. So now we have 3 possible inversions, and I'm going to show you what those 3 are. So again, it's the same process. We're taking the bottom note of the chord and we're moving it to the top. So I'm going to draw my C right there. Same thing, I'm going to slide the other notes over and I'm going to draw my B right next to the C. It's the interval of a second. I simply slide the G and the E over as well, and now I have a C7 chord in first inversion. And now if I color this in, the root of my chord is up on the top. My second inversion, again, I'm taking my bottom note, I am moving it up an octave. I have an E on the top, I slide everything over. I have a C, a B, and a G. We'll talk about cleaning up the notation a little bit because you really don't want to have it written this way. But that is a second inversion. But I'm showing you so that you can continue to see where the root note is. I'm showing it to you this way. You could also move the E over, but it's okay however you do it. We have one more possibility, which is a third inversion. Remember when we had a triad and only 3 notes, we only had 2 inversions. But now we can do this one more time. I can take my G, I can move it to the top, I slide my E over, and now I have my C, my C and my B on the bottom. I'm coloring in where the root of the chord went. So there is now my third inversion. That looks like an A, not a B. We're doing quick. Okay, so now I have a C7 chord, root, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion, and I've colored in where the C has moved as we've traveled through these inversions in the chord. So in the first inversion, the C is on the top. The second inversion, the C and the interval of the second is in the middle. And in the third inversion, the interval of the second is on the bottom of the chord. Now, playing 4 notes is cumbersome on piano. And so quite often, as musicians, we simplify a 7th chord down to 3 notes and sometimes even 2 notes. So that's what we're going to do next, is we're going to take, and what we do when we simplify is we tend to rely on the first inversion. So quite often in first inversion, you will find a C7 chord without the interval of the 5th in the middle, and it's still a C7 chord. So all I did is I took out the G in the middle, and if I do, I'll play here, I'm going to play it down here. Here's a C chord. I'm playing this in the bass clef. It's a C7 with B natural. If I do the first inversion and play all the notes, it sounds like this. If I take out the G, it sounds like that. So taking out that 5th interval note does not change the sound dramatically. So unless there's a reason to have that 5th interval note in there, you can quite easily take it out and shorten your chord and make it playable in 3 notes. Quite often 7th chords will do this, and they sound good when you have the interval of the 2nd written on the top, and then you have your other, originally what was the interval of the 3rd on the bottom. And that's a very, very common way that you will see 7th chords written in all types of music. You can do the same thing. You can make the same cuts in the 2nd and 3rd inversions. The other way that we typically see a chord, like a C7 chord, is we simply see it as 2 notes only. And we would see it as, and it doesn't matter what inversion you take it from, but you would see it as a C and a B flat, or a C and a regular B. This is also okay to play that as a C7 chord, 2 notes. You probably have played this before and maybe did not know it in the bass clef. One of the most common 7th chord combinations in the bass clef when you're learning piano is the G7 chord. It's one of the first that's introduced in most standard methods. And the G7 is G and F. The F is the 7th tone of the G scale. And so that's how it's presented most often in music. You may not know it yet. You may not have even learned chords yet. But in beginning piano, the G7 chord is quite easy for most beginning piano players to play. And you don't have to know that it's a G7 chord yet, but that's one way to play it. You can, of course, add the B to the bottom of that chord, and it's still a G7 chord. But now it has the 3rd interval in there. It's inverted to this form, first inversion. Okay? So now let me back up, and we're going to talk about slash chords. And you can apply this to regular chords that do not have a 7th, but I'm going to show it to you how it applies to the chords with a 7th. Okay? Let me erase a couple things here, and we're almost done. So a C7 chord, if it is notated in a lead sheet or somewhere else, or like a 1-7, if your piece is in C major and it's noted as a 1-7 chord, it can be notated as that too. It can be notated as a 5-7 chord if you're in a different key, for example. But the point is, we can still label this, if we're playing from a lead sheet, as a C7 chord, and you would see it above the music if you're playing from a lead sheet. Doesn't matter how, so you're not going to have the notation. It'll just say C7 above a melody line or C7 on a chord chart. And you just have to know what the chord is. If we said, okay, if the composer or arranger said, I want this to be a C7 chord, but I don't want it in its root form, I want it in its inverted form, that's where the slash is going to come in. And now in first inversion, you can see that my bottom note in first inversion is now an E. So when I write C7/E, that means I'm telling you I want a C7 chord, but played in its first inversion, because I want that particular sound. I don't want C7 written, or I don't want to hear it this way. I want to hear it this way. Okay? If I do a similar thing with a second inversion, I might write in a piece of music that I'm arranging, I want a C7 chord, but I don't want it played in first inversion or in its root form. I want it played in second inversion. So I'm writing C/G. The note after the slash indicates the bottom note that you are to play of that chord. This is basic, so there are some instances where you'll have a note after the slash that does not occur in the chord. We're not going to cover that in this video. We're already going too long. And then finally, I can notate this last chord in third inversion. I can write C7/B. You won't see that very often, but once in a while. And that means you're going to invert the chord again, and you're going to play it with the B on the bottom, and you're still going to play it as a C7 chord. Now, do you have to use all of the notes? No. You do in a C7 with a G chord, you do still have to include the G, but you could take out one of the other notes if you wanted to. Again, you're not going to find this one very often, and you may not find that one very often either, but you could easily take out the top G here if you're going to play the C7 with a B on the bottom. Most of the time, the notation that you'll see for a 7th chord is going to land you in first inversion. Now, if you want to practice this, which I encourage you to do with a piece of music, I would encourage you to write chords in inversions. So just to keep this quick and easy, I am going to do one example for you and then we'll end the video here. So I am writing a D major chord in root position and I'm putting the chord symbol D up on top. That capital D indicates D major. If I wanted it to be minor on a lead sheet, I would put a small m. We're not going to do minor in this one. Okay? Let's say that I want the person playing the piece that I'm working on to play it as a slash chord, and I don't want the D on the bottom. I want it voiced differently. I want the F sharp on the bottom. So this is how I would notate it on the staff. And now you can see that that D, F sharp chord notation is a first inversion. I might want in my arrangement, or I might want my student to play a D chord with the A on the bottom. So I'm going to write D/A. And in that case, I have A on the bottom. Sorry. I have my D in the middle. There's my root note. And now my F sharp is on the top. So now I have a chord, the D major chord in second inversion. That's a slash chord. The same applies with a 7th like I just showed you. You just have one more note to deal with. Okay? So if you have a letter after a slash, that means invert the chord. And now you know how to invert chords out of root position, and you know how to build a 7th chord. If you have questions, of course, contact me if you're a student of mine, or if you're not a student of mine in my studio, I encourage you to contact your teacher or to do some more practice on your own, maybe with a good theory workbook. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.